Sarah Jenkins unlocked the front door of her new home with trembling fingers, the weight of the house keys still unfamiliar in her hand. After years of cramped apartment living and meticulous saving, she finally had a place to call her own. The charming craftsman in Oakwood Estates needed some TLC, but the bones were good, just like her real estate agent had promised. As Sarah carried her first box through the doorway, she caught sight of an older man standing at the edge of her driveway, watching her with undisguised interest. His pressed khakis and polo shirt seemed at odds with the scowl etched across his weathered face. "Hello there," Sarah called, setting down her box and walking toward him with an extended hand. "I'm Sarah, your new neighbor." The man straightened his posture, but didn't take her hand. "Gerald Hoffman. I live next door." His eyes darted past her to the house. "This property has certain standards to maintain." Before Sarah could respond, Gerald turned and walked away, leaving her hand suspended awkwardly in the air. From her peripheral vision, she noticed curtains twitching in other windows along the street. Something told her first impressions mattered greatly in Oakwood Estates, and hers had apparently fallen short. Sarah shook off the uncomfortable encounter and returned to unloading her moving truck. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her new lawn as she carried box after box inside. Her college roommate Mia arrived an hour later with pizza and helped arrange furniture until well past midnight. They collapsed onto Sarah's couch, surrounded by half-empty boxes and mismatched furniture. "So what's the neighborhood like?" Mia asked between bites of cold pizza. Sarah hesitated. "Quiet. Very. Orderly. I met one neighbor briefly. He seemed intense." "Intense how?" "Like he was inspecting me rather than meeting me." Mia laughed. Classic suburban vibes. Everyone's in everyone's business. The next morning, Sarah woke to the mechanical whir of a lawnmower. Peering through her bedroom curtains, she saw Gerald meticulously cutting his grass in perfectly straight lines. His yard looked like something from a magazine. Not a flower out of place. Hedges trimmed with mathematical precision. The stark contrast of her own overgrown lawn made her wince. After breakfast, Sarah ventured outside to collect her mail. An older woman walking a small Yorkshire Terrier paused at the edge of her driveway. "You must be the new owner," the woman said with a warm smile that immediately put Sarah at ease. "I'm Dorothy Winters, 3 doors down." Sarah Jenkins. Just moved in yesterday. Dorothy's eyes darted briefly toward Gerald's house before she lowered her voice. "How was your welcome from Gerald?" "Brief," Sarah replied diplomatically. "Not exactly friendly." Dorothy nodded knowingly. "Don't take it personally, dear. He's that way with everyone, especially new people." "Does he always watch people like that?" Sarah asked, recounting how she'd caught him staring at her house twice already that morning. "Gerald takes his role as HOA president very seriously," Dorothy explained. "Too seriously, if you ask most of us. Just make sure you read all the bylaws carefully." She glanced at Sarah's overgrown lawn, particularly the landscaping requirements. As they chatted, Sarah noticed Gerald emerge from his garage carrying a camera with a long lens. He photographed his own perfect lawn, then swiveled and, without any attempt at subtlety, took several photos of Sarah's overgrown grass and the moving boxes still visible through her open front door. "Is he documenting my yard?" Sarah asked incredulously. Dorothy sighed. "Welcome to Oakwood Estates, dear, where your business is everyone's business, especially Gerald Hoffman's." Later that afternoon, an envelope appeared in Sarah's mailbox. Inside was a printed copy of the HOA regulations, all 37 pages, with certain sections highlighted in neon yellow. A handwritten note was paperclipped to the front. "For your immediate attention. Compliance expected within 14 days. 3 weeks later, Sarah hummed as she planted vibrant begonias along her front walkway, enjoying the April sunshine warming her back. She'd had spent the weekend mowing her lawn to the exact 2.5-inch height specified in the HOA guidelines and power washing her driveway until it gleamed. The flowers were her small touch of personality in the otherwise cookie-cutter neighborhood. The crunch of footsteps on gravel made her look up. Gerald Hoffman stood over her, his shadow falling across the flowers. "Those aren't approved plantings," he said, a manila folder tucked under one arm. "As president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, it's my duty to inform you of the breach." Sarah sat back on her heels. "I'm sorry. They're just flowers." Gerald extracted a document from his folder and thrust it toward her. Section 7, Paragraph 3 clearly states all exterior modifications require written approval. The previous owners understood our standards. As Sarah scanned the dense document, Gerald added casually, "They sold rather quickly, you know. Some people simply aren't cut out for the responsibilities of proper homeownership." Something in his tone made Sarah's skin prickle despite the warm day. "I'll apply for approval then," Sarah offered, trying to keep her voice level. "Is there a form?" Gerald's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. The committee meets quarterly to review applications. The next meeting is in 2 months." He glanced pointedly at the freshly planted flowers. "In the meantime, these will need to be removed by tomorrow." 2 months? For approval to plant flowers? Rules are rules, Ms. Jenkins. Order must be maintained. He surveyed her property with a critical eye. "Your garage door appears to be the incorrect shade of taupe as well. I'll be noting that in my weekly inspection report." After Gerald left, Sarah noticed a curtain twitch across the street. Dorothy emerged moments later, crossing the road with purpose, her Yorkshire Terrier trotting alongside her. "I saw Gerald making his rounds," she said sympathetically. "The begonias." Sarah nodded, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. "Apparently, they're contraband." Dorothy lowered her voice. "Listen, dear. Gerald has driven away 3 homeowners from this property in the past 5 years. The last family lasted only 7 months. Because of flowers. It starts with flowers. Then it's the mailbox position. Then it's the invisible infractions only Gerald can see." Dorothy glanced around nervously. "Between us, I think he wants this house for himself. He made an offer when the Thompsons left, but they sold to you instead." That evening, Sarah drove around the neighborhood, noticing the eerie uniformity for the first time. Every house had the same landscaping, identical hedges, matching river rock borders, and the same variety of yellow daylilies spaced at precise intervals. Even the welcome mats seemed uniform, as though issued by the HOA rather than chosen by individual homeowners. Returning home, Sarah found a white envelope taped to her door. Inside was a formal citation for unapproved botanical specimens, with a $50 fine and a notice that the violation would double each day the begonias remained in place. She dialed the HOA office number listed on the notice. When the voicemail picked up, Sarah recognized Gerald's precise diction. "You've reached the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. All violation inquiries must be submitted in writing with the appropriate filing fee of $25. The board will respond within 30 business days." Sarah hung up and stared at her beautiful begonias. With a sigh, she grabbed a trowel and began digging them up in the fading light. From across the street, she could feel eyes watching her capitulation with satisfaction. That night, she called her real estate agent. "Did you know about the HOA situation here? About Gerald Hoffman?" There was a long pause. "I thought they might have exaggerated in the disclosure. Every neighborhood has a difficult neighbor." "He's not difficult," Sarah replied. "He's methodical. And I think he wants my house." Homeownership quickly became a nightmare for Sarah. Her mailbox filled with HOA notices citing infractions from incorrect trash bin placement to excessive bird feeder activity. When she hosted her sister for a weekend visit, Sarah returned from grocery shopping to find a parking ticket on her sister's car for being improperly aligned in the driveway. "This is ridiculous," her sister Beth exclaimed, waving the $75 citation. "Your car is parked exactly the same way." Sarah sighed. "Mine has the required Oakwood Estates parking permit on the windshield. Yours doesn't. You can't be serious." "Welcome to my world." Sarah placed the citation with the growing stack on her kitchen counter. In just 2 months, she had accumulated over $800 in fines, each more absurd than the last. The neighborhood summer barbecue should have been a chance to meet her neighbors properly, but Sarah felt eyes following her as she navigated the pristine community park. Gerald held court near the grills, clipboard in hand even at a social event. "Enjoying Oakwood Estates?" asked a friendly man in his 40s as Sarah filled her plate with potato salad. "It has its challenges," she replied diplomatically. The man laughed. "That's one way to put it. I'm Mark Chen, 2 streets over." He lowered his voice. "You've got the haunted house." "Excuse me?" "That's what the kids call it. No one stays there long." Before Mark could elaborate, Gerald appeared, inserting himself between them. "Mr. Chen, your gazebo installation request requires additional documentation. The dimensions appear to exceed guidelines." Gerald's eyes never left Sarah as he spoke to Mark. Later that week, Sarah was pruning her HOA-approved hedges when she noticed something odd. A small metal stake with orange flagging tape had appeared at the corner of her property. She frowned, certain it hadn't been there the day before. Walking the perimeter of her yard, Sarah discovered 3 more stakes, each positioned several feet inside what her property survey showed as her boundary. With growing concern, she pulled out her closing documents, confirming her property lines against the stakes. The turning point came when Sarah discovered a small surveyor's stake hammered into the ground 6 feet inside what she believed was her property line. When confronted, Gerald smiled thinly. "I've been reviewing the original property surveys," he explained. "There appears to be a significant discrepancy with your boundaries." "That's impossible," Sarah replied. "I have the survey from my closing." Gerald's smile didn't waver. "Documents can be incorrect. These stakes reflect the original development plans." That evening, Sarah knocked on the door of Elena Rodriguez, the only neighbor who had brought her a welcome basket when she moved in. "Gerald's obsessed with your house," Elena admitted, inviting Sarah inside. "He tried to buy it when the Thompsons listed it, but they rejected his offer. He's been fuming ever since." "But why my house specifically?" Sarah asked. Elena hesitated. "The rumor is that property was originally promised to him by the developer 30 years ago. Something fell through with financing and it went to someone else. He's been trying to get it ever since. The last 3 owners all sold within a year." "How do you know all this?" Sarah asked. Elena opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. "Because I used to be on the HOA board before Gerald took over. I kept copies of everything." She spread several documents across her kitchen table. "Look at the violation history for your address compared to others on the street." The disparity was striking. Sarah's property had received 3 times more citations than any other home in Oakwood Estates. Even more revealing was a pattern. Each previous owner had experienced escalating violations until they sold. "He's been targeting this house for years," Elena confirmed. "And now he's moving to phase 2 with those boundary stakes." As Sarah walked home in the fading light, she noticed Gerald standing in his upstairs window, watching her return. For the first time, she didn't feel just annoyed. She felt afraid. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday. Sarah signed for it, with a sense of dread, recognizing the return address of Hoffman Legal Matters. Inside the manila envelope, she found formal letterhead with Gerald's name and a previously undisclosed legal title. Gerald Hoffman, Esquire, Property Specialist. Sarah's hand shook as she read the formal legal notice claiming her house encroached significantly on the Gerald's property due to an incorrect survey conducted in 1989. According to the attached documents, which looked oddly worn for supposedly recent findings, nearly 1/3 of her house sat on land that legally belonged to Gerald Hoffman. The letter ended with an ultimatum: acknowledge the encroachment and pay substantial damages, or face immediate legal action. The proposed settlement would require Sarah to pay Gerald $15,000 for historical use of the disputed area, plus monthly easement fees of $850 for the continued occupation of his land. The alternative was to relocate the physical structure of her home, an impossibility designed to force her to sell. Sarah called her real estate attorney immediately, forwarding the documents and arranging an emergency meeting for the following day. That night, she barely slept, imagining worst-case scenarios where she lost her home and savings in one fell swoop. Her attorney, Michael Dawson, reviewed the documents with a furrowed brow. "These survey markings look unusual. The paper appears artificially aged, and these stamps don't match county standards. So it's fake." Sarah asked hopefully. "Let's not jump to conclusions. We need to verify with county records first." Sarah's call to the county records office revealed that no new survey had been filed. When she mentioned Gerald Hoffman, the clerk sighed audibly. "He requests those original development plans at least twice a year," the woman noted. "Always makes copies of the same pages." When pressed further, the clerk became more forthcoming. "Between us, we've had concerns about modifications to those copies. Nothing we could prove, but enough that we now require him to view documents only in our supervised reading room." That afternoon, Sarah and Michael hired an independent surveyor, who arrived with sophisticated GPS equipment. As he worked along the property line, Gerald emerged from his house, camera in hand. "Wasting your money," he called out pleasantly. "The original surveys are quite clear." The surveyor, Jim Bracken, had 30 years of experience and an unflappable demeanor. "I'll let the measurements speak for themselves, sir," he replied without looking up from his equipment. 3 hours later, Jim confirmed what Sarah already suspected. Your home is exactly where it should be, properly positioned within the lot lines. There's no encroachment whatsoever. When presented with these findings, Gerald remained unmoved. Modern equipment is notoriously unreliable. The historical documents tell the true story. That night, Sarah photographed her property stakes and compared them with her deed. Everything matched perfectly, except for the new stake Gerald had placed. Her home was exactly where it should be. Her doorbell rang just as she finished. Gerald stood on her porch, hands clasped behind his back. "Have you made a decision about my offer?" he asked pleasantly, as though they were discussing borrowing a cup of sugar. "There's nothing to decide," Sarah replied. "Your survey is wrong." Gerald's pleasant expression didn't waver. "You know, the Thompsons thought the same thing. They changed their minds eventually. Everyone does." After he left, Sarah noticed a small drone hovering near her upstairs windows. When she stepped outside to look, it quickly retreated to Gerald's backyard. The invasion of privacy was reaching new heights. Literally. That night, Sarah called Elena. "He's escalating." "What happened to the Thompsons exactly?" Elena's voice was grim. Strange accidents began happening. Water damage from mysterious leaks. Electrical problems. Their insurance premiums skyrocketed after multiple claims. "You think Gerald sabotaged their house?" "I can't prove it, but they sold at a 30% loss just to escape." And guess who made an offer immediately after they listed? Sarah took a week off work, not to vacation but to become an amateur detective. The mounting evidence of Gerald's obsession demanded action beyond legal responses. She started by installing security cameras around her property, positioning them to cover every possible angle of approach. If Gerald was planning any accidents, he would be recorded. Her first investigative stop was the county clerk's office, where she requested access to all property records related to her address dating back to the original development. The clerk, Jenny Martinez, seemed relieved that someone was finally digging deeper. "Your property has quite the file," Jenny commented, wheeling out a cart with several boxes. "Most homes have maybe one folder of documents. Yours has generated requests every few months for years." Sarah spent hours poring over dusty files, making copies of original surveys, deed transfers, and permit applications. A pattern emerged. Each time a new owner took possession, a flurry of HOA complaints would follow, then boundary disputes, and finally a quick sale. From the clerk's office, Sarah visited the property assessor, who confirmed her lot dimensions hadn't changed since the neighborhood's creation. "The original pins are still in place," he assured her. "I checked them myself last year after another inquiry about your property." "Let me guess, from Gerald Hoffman?" The assessor's tight smile was answer enough. Sarah's investigation led her to the retirement community 2 towns over, where she finally tracked down the original developer of Oakwood Estates. Now retired and living in a modest bungalow with a meticulously maintained garden, 80-year-old Frank Mercer welcomed her into his home, eyes brightening when she mentioned Oakwood Estates. "My finest development," he said proudly, before his expression clouded at Gerald's name. "Hoffman. Yes, I remember him well." The story Frank told left Sarah stunned. Gerald had indeed put a deposit on Lot 47, her current home, but had later demanded upgrades that weren't part of the contract. When Frank refused, Gerald withdrew, demanding his deposit back. The house was built to the original specifications and sold to another buyer. "He's convinced himself that I cheated him," Frank explained, "been holding that grudge for 3 decades. But the bombshell came when Frank pulled out his original files. After the second homeowner complained about harassment, I kept documentation. Inside was a letter from Gerald dated 15 years ago, offering to purchase the house at half its market value to resolve the ongoing property dispute. 3 different homeowners had received similar letters. He's not just a difficult neighbor, Sarah realized. He's been running a scheme to devalue the property and acquire it cheaply. Frank nodded grimly. "I've been waiting for someone to connect the dots. The others just wanted out. They sold and moved on. You're the first to investigate." As Sarah gathered the damning evidence, Frank offered one final insight. Gerald was different before his wife died. Particular, yes, but not malicious. After Elizabeth passed, this obsession consumed him. It's like he needed something to control when his life spun out of control. The revelation added a layer of complexity to Gerald's actions. Not an excuse, but perhaps an explanation. The next day, Sarah noticed something she'd overlooked. Tiny cameras positioned along Gerald's property line, all aimed at her house. He hadn't just been watching her. He'd been documenting her every move, building a fabricated case against her through selective evidence. Sarah shared her findings with her attorney, who was preparing a cease and desist letter. This goes beyond harassment into potential fraud, Michael noted. These falsified surveys could constitute criminal charges. As Sarah left his office, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The man identified himself as Gerald's nephew, Thomas Hoffman. "We need to talk about my uncle," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Things are worse than you realize. He's not well." Sarah arrived at the courthouse steps with her attorney beside her, prepared for Gerald's lawsuit. Instead, she found a small crowd gathered. Elena, several other neighbors, and Frank Mercer had all come to support her. Gerald appeared with a thin man carrying a leather briefcase. He faltered momentarily at the sight of Frank. The surprise witness changed everything. Gerald's own nephew stepped forward, explaining his recent discovery of altered documents on his uncle's computer. Years of manipulated surveys, photoshopped images showing property stakes in different positions, and a detailed journal outlining his reclamation project. "My uncle needs help," the young man explained quietly. "After my aunt died 5 years ago, this obsession took over completely." The most shocking twist came when medical records were submitted showing Gerald had recently been diagnosed with a frontotemporal disorder affecting his judgment and behavior, a condition he hidden from everyone. The case was dismissed, and Gerald's family intervened with proper medical care. 6 months later, under appropriate treatment, Gerald sold his house and moved to assisted living near his nephew's family. Before leaving, a very different Gerald, clear-eyed and medicated, knocked on Sarah's door. "I'm told I owe you an apology," he said haltingly. "The doctor says I became fixated on things that weren't real." Sarah nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting his words. The new owners seemed nice, she offered instead. A young couple. They asked about garden recommendations. As Gerald turned to leave, Sarah noticed Frank Mercer helping the new neighbors move in. The elderly developer waved cheerfully, a box of housewarming gifts in his arms, a symbolic passing of the torch to a new generation in Oakwood Estates. That evening, Sarah sat on her porch swing, feeling truly at home for the first time. Her phone chimed with a message from Elena, inviting her to join the newly formed neighborhood association, with Sarah nominated as vice president. The message ended with, "We need someone who knows the difference between enforcing rules and building a community." Sarah smiled and looked up at her house, all of it undeniably securely hers.